June 1944. England. An American airbase somewhere in the muddy fields of East Anglia. In exactly 47 minutes, 12 P-47 Thunderbolts would take off for a critical bombing mission over France. 11 of them made it. One didn't. Not because of enemy fire, not because of mechanical failure, but because of a fuel line leak the size of a pinhole that nobody could fix. The mechanic's name was Robert Henderson, 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who'd never seen an airplane until he enlisted. And in his trembling hands, covered in aviation fuel, he held a toothbrush. The same toothbrush a pilot had tossed him as a joke when Henderson asked if anyone had anything that could plug a high-pressure fuel line. What happened next saved 42 lives that day, changed tactical aviation doctrine for the rest of the war, and proved that sometimes the most brilliant engineering solutions come not from West Point graduates or MIT professors, but from a kid who once fixed his father's tractor with baling wire and prayer. This is the story of how a toothbrush won World War II. Let me take you back. Spring 1944. The Allied invasion of Europe was weeks away. Every single mission mattered. Every single plane counted. The Luftwaffe was wounded, but still deadly. German anti-aircraft guns were getting better, more accurate, more lethal. American bomber crews were dying at rates that would horrify modern military planners. For every 10 men who flew combat missions over Europe, 3 never came home. The P-47 Thunderbolt was supposed to change that. A beast of a fighter plane. 7 tons of American steel and fury. 8 50 caliber machine guns. A radial engine so powerful it could outrun almost anything the Germans had. But the P-47 had a problem. Actually, it had several problems, but one was killing more pilots than enemy fighters. Fuel system failures. The Republic aviation engineers had designed a complex system of lines, pumps, and valves to feed that massive Pratt & Whitney engine. When everything worked, the P-47 was magnificent. When one component failed, when one seal cracked, when one line developed a leak, the entire aircraft became a flying bomb waiting to ignite. Between January and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 17 P-47s to fuel system fires. Not combat losses, maintenance failures. 17 pilots dead because a rubber seal deteriorated, or a fuel line cracked, or a valve stuck open. The engineers tried everything. New seals made from different compounds, reinforced fuel lines, additional safety valves. Nothing worked reliably. The P-47's engine vibrated so violently, generated so much heat, created such stress on every component that parts failed constantly. And here's the nightmare that kept commanders awake at night. They didn't have spare parts. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Every fuel line, every seal, every valve had to be shipped from America, across an ocean full of German submarines, through a logistics system already stretched to breaking point, supplying an army of millions. When a P-47 developed a fuel leak standard procedure was to ground the aircraft. Mark it as non-operational. Wait for parts. Sometimes that wait was days, sometimes weeks. And while that plane sat idle, men died because they didn't have fighter cover. Bombers burned because there weren't enough escorts. Missions failed because the numbers didn't add up. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody paid attention to. Robert Henderson grew up on a farm outside Des Moines. His father raised corn and fixed machinery. Not because he enjoyed it, because they couldn't afford to replace anything. In the Depression, you learned to make things work, or you starved. Henderson's earliest memory was watching his father repair a broken combine harvester using parts from an old Ford Model T. "Boy," his father had said, "remember this. The right part is the one that works. Don't matter what the manual says." Henderson enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Failed the pilot exam. His vision was slightly off, 2025 instead of 2020. The difference between flying fighters and fixing them. They sent him to technical school, taught him engine maintenance, hydraulics, fuel systems. 6 months of intensive training that was supposed to prepare him for anything. It didn't prepare him for England, for the rain that never stopped, for the mud that got into everything, for the cold that made metal brittle and rubber seals crack, for the reality that textbook solutions didn't work when you were standing in a field at 4 in the morning trying to prep 12 fighters for a dawn mission with half the parts you needed and none of the time. Henderson arrived at the 56th Fighter Group in March 1944. The crew chief, a hard Texas sergeant named Morrison, looked at the baby-faced Iowa farm boy and said, "You ever work on anything bigger than a tractor?" Henderson said, "No, sir." Morrison said, "Good. Means you ain't got any bad habits to unlearn." For 3 months, Henderson learned, not from manuals, from watching, from doing, from failing. He learned that the official repair procedures assumed you had every tool and every part. Reality meant improvising, using what you had, making things work because lives depended on it. He watched older mechanics wrap damaged fuel lines with electrical tape, jam wooden wedges into cracked housings, pack failing seals with grease to buy a few more hours of operation. None of it was in the manual. All of it was necessary. But some problems couldn't be improvised away. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion everyone had been preparing for. The 56th Fighter Group flew 4 missions that day, protecting bombers, strafing German positions, fighting off the Luftwaffe. Every plane mattered. Every pilot counted. Henderson worked 22 hours straight, rearming aircraft, refueling them, fixing battle damage, sending them back into the air, again, and again, and again. By June 7th, he'd been awake for 36 hours. His hands shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. His coveralls were soaked in aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and sweat. He smelled like a refinery, looked like a corpse, felt like hell. But the planes kept flying. Until June 8th. 0430 hours. Dawn mission briefing in 90 minutes. Henderson was doing final checks on a P-47D nicknamed Lucky Lady. The pilot, Lieutenant James Kerrigan, was 21 years old. 17 combat missions. A kid from Boston who flew like he was invincible because he hadn't learned yet that he wasn't. Henderson was checking the starboard fuel line connections when he felt it, wetness on his fingertips. He pulled his hand back. Aviation fuel. He grabbed a flashlight, traced the line, found the leak, a crack in the aluminum tubing where it connected to the fuel pump. Tiny, maybe 3 millimeters long. But at operational pressure, that crack would spray atomized fuel directly onto the exhaust manifold. The engine would ignite like a Roman candle. Kerrigan would have maybe 5 seconds to bail out. Maybe. Henderson ran to find Morrison. "We got a fuel line leak on Lucky Lady, the starboard pump connection." Morrison came over, looked at it, said a word that would get censored from any respectable history book. "We got spares." Henderson already knew the answer. They'd used the last replacement fuel line 2 days ago. The next supply shipment wasn't due until Friday. This was Wednesday. Morrison stood there, calculating, thinking. Every mission was planned around 12 aircraft. They'd already lost 2 P-47s to battle damage on D-Day. Another was down for engine work. If Lucky Lady couldn't fly, that left 8 operational fighters, 8 planes to escort 36 bombers. The math didn't work. Men would die. Morrison made the call every crew chief dreaded. "Ground it. We'll requisition emergency parts." Henderson knew what that meant. Lucky Lady would sit idle. Kerrigan would be reassigned to another plane bumping some other pilot. The mission would proceed with inadequate fighter cover. And somewhere over France, bombers would burn. He stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at that tiny crack, and thought about his father's combine harvester. The right part is the one that works. The official story says Henderson spent the next hour trying standard repairs. Wrapping the crack with tape, applying sealant, attempting to splice in a section from a damaged fuel line. Nothing held at operational pressure. The unofficial story, the one the mechanics told each other over beers, was different. Henderson knew immediately that none of the standard fixes would work. This wasn't a pinhole leak you could plug. This was a structural crack in tubing that operated at 80 pounds per square inch. Any repair had to be rigid, had to seal completely, had to withstand pressure and vibration and heat. And he had nothing. No spare lines, no proper fittings, no materials rated for aviation fuel systems. He sat on the tarmac, put his head in his hands. And that's when Kerrigan walked up. The pilot had been watching, knew his plane was grounded, knew he'd missed the mission. "You look like you need this," Kerrigan said, and tossed something. Henderson caught it reflexively. A toothbrush, standard issue, white plastic handle, nylon bristles. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Henderson asked. Kerrigan shrugged. "You're the mechanic. I'm just the guy who flies them." He walked away. Henderson sat there, holding a toothbrush, staring at a fuel line. And then he saw it. The plastic handle. Rigid. Smooth. About the same diameter as the fuel line tubing. He pulled out his pocket knife, the one his father had given him when he turned 12. The blade was dull from 3 months of field work. He cut the toothbrush handle, lengthwise, creating 2 semicircular sections. Took him 4 tries to get the cut clean. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion and the absolute insanity of what he was considering. He took 1/2 of the toothbrush handle, placed it over the crack. It fit. Almost perfectly. The curve of the plastic matched the curve of the tubing. He took the other half, positioned it on the opposite side, creating a rigid sleeve around the damaged section. Now came the hard part. He needed to seal it, secure it, make it pressure tight. He had electrical tape, wire, and a tube of aviation sealant that was technically only rated for low-pressure applications. He wrapped the toothbrush sleeve with wire, tight, creating compression, then wrapped it with electrical tape. 4 layers, 5, 6, sealing every gap. Finally, he coated the entire thing with sealant. It looked ridiculous, like something a child would build, like a joke. Morrison walked over, stared at it, said another word that won't make it into respectable history books. "You cannot be serious." Henderson said, "It'll hold. That's a toothbrush. It's rigid plastic rated for human use. The fuel line operates at 80 psi. This plastic can withstand way more than that. It's not rated for aviation fuel. Neither is half the stuff we've been using for 3 months." Morrison looked at him, looked at the repair, looked at the clock. 45 minutes until takeoff. He made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. "Test it." Henderson connected a pressure gauge, activated the fuel pump. The pump began forcing fuel through the system. 10 psi. The repair held. 20 psi. Held. 40 psi. Held. 60 psi. Held. 80 psi. Operational pressure. The gauge held steady. No pressure drop. No leak. Henderson shut down the pump, examined the repair. Bone dry. Morrison stared at it like he was witnessing a miracle, which, in a sense, he was. "How long will it hold?" "I have no idea." "That's not the answer I wanted." Henderson looked at him. "Sergeant, I just fixed a high-pressure fuel line with a toothbrush. You want guarantees? Call Republic Aviation." Morrison almost smiled. Almost. "Kerrigan flies it. He knows it's got a field repair. His choice." They found Kerrigan in the ready room, told him. The pilot looked at both of them. "You fixed my plane with a toothbrush." "Yes, sir." "Will it get me to France and back?" Henderson said the only thing he could say. The truth. "I don't know." Kerrigan stood up, grabbed his flight gear. Then let's find out. 20 minutes later, 12 P-47 Thunderbolts roared into the dawn sky. Lucky Lady's engine note was perfect, smooth, powerful, no hesitation. Henderson watched until they disappeared into the clouds. Then he sat down on the tarmac and threw up from sheer nervous exhaustion. Morrison handed him a canteen. "You just violated about 17 maintenance regulations." "Yes, sir. If that repair fails and Kerrigan dies, they'll court-martial you." "Yes, sir." "And if it works?" Henderson didn't answer, because he had no idea what happened if it worked. 4 hours later, they got the call. Mission successful. All 12 aircraft returning. No losses. Henderson was refueling another P-47 when Lucky Lady landed. The engine sounded fine. Perfect, even. Kerrigan climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His plane had taken ground fire. 3 holes in the left wing, 1 in the tail. But the engine had never missed a beat. Morrison and Henderson inspected the fuel line repair. Still holding. Still dry. Still impossible. A group captain from headquarters showed up that afternoon. Word had spread. Someone had repaired a fuel line with a toothbrush and the damn thing worked. The captain examined Lucky Lady, examined the repair, examined Henderson like he was some kind of exotic specimen. "Who authorized this?" Morrison stepped forward. "I did, sir." "What's your name, mechanic?" Henderson saluted. "Corporal Robert Henderson, sir." "And you thought of this how—" Henderson said what his father would have said. "The right part is the one that works, sir." The captain stared at him, then started laughing. Not mockery, genuine amazement. "Corporal, you just violated every procedure in the maintenance manual." "Yes, sir." "And possibly saved this pilot's life." "I hope so, sir." The captain looked at Morrison. "How long has that repair been holding?" 6 hours, sir. 4 of them at combat operational status." "And you're telling me a toothbrush is keeping that fuel line sealed?" "Appears that way, sir." The captain shook his head. "Write it up. Full report. I want engineering to see this." He turned to leave. Stopped. Looked back at Henderson. "Corporal, what made you think this would work?" Henderson thought about Iowa, about his father, about Depression-era farms where you fixed things or you failed. "Sir, I grew up believing that any problem can be solved if you're willing to use whatever's in your pocket." The captain smiled. "Carry on." But this was just the beginning. Because that toothbrush repair stayed in Lucky Lady for 3 more missions, flew 8 more combat hours, withstood enemy fire extreme vibration temperature variations from -20 to +40 Celsius, and never leaked a single drop. They didn't know it yet, but Henderson had just proven something that would change field maintenance doctrine for the rest of the war. Sometimes the best solution isn't the official one. Sometimes innovation comes from necessity. Sometimes a farm boy with a pocket knife knows more than the engineers who designed the aircraft. Word spread through the 8th Air Force. The mechanic who fixed a fighter with a toothbrush. Other maintenance crews started experimenting, testing, adapting, finding solutions that weren't in any manual. But that's a story for part 2. Because what happened next was even more remarkable. When the Luftwaffe captured a downed P-47 and examined its fuel systems, they found something that confused the hell out of their engineers. Evidence of field repairs using materials that shouldn't work. Couldn't work. According to everything they knew about aviation engineering. And yet, clearly DID work. The Germans spent weeks trying to figure out what new wonder material the Americans had developed. They never guessed it was a toothbrush. In part 2, we'll see how Henderson's improvisation sparked a revolution in field maintenance, how his methods saved hundreds of aircraft, how a simple idea from a farm boy became standard doctrine, and how the Allies gained a crucial advantage not through superior technology, but through superior adaptation. Because in war, victory doesn't always go to the side with the best equipment. Sometimes it goes to the side with mechanics creative enough to fix that equipment with whatever they have in their pockets. So a farm boy from Iowa just fixed a P-47 Thunderbolt with a toothbrush. The repair held through 4 combat missions, saved a pilot's life, proved that sometimes the best engineering comes from desperation and a pocket knife. But here's what they don't tell you about innovation in wartime. Success in the field means nothing if the people at headquarters don't believe it. And in June 1944, headquarters was about to become Henderson's biggest enemy. Because while that toothbrush held Lucky Lady together, 17 more P-47s sat grounded across England, waiting for parts that wouldn't arrive for weeks. Parts that Henderson could probably improvise in hours, if anyone would let him try. The problem wasn't the Germans anymore. It was a man named Colonel Richard Ashford, West Point class of 1925, 20 years of military service. A man who believed that regulations were written in blood and breaking them was treason. And he was about to make Henderson's life absolute hell. The morning after Lucky Lady's 4th successful mission, Henderson was summoned to headquarters. Not requested. Summoned. Morrison tried to warn him. "The colonel heard about your toothbrush. He's not happy." Henderson didn't understand. "The repair worked. We got a plane back in the air. That's the problem. You made the official procedures look stupid." Henderson walked into Ashford's office at 0800 hours. The colonel sat behind a desk covered in maintenance reports. Every one of them documented by the book repairs, approved procedures, authorized materials. Everything Henderson's toothbrush wasn't. Ashford didn't look up. "Corporal Henderson, sit." Henderson sat. Ashford finally looked at him. Cold blue eyes. The kind of stare that made junior officers wet themselves. "I've read the report on your fuel line repair. Using a civilian toothbrush. Unauthorized materials. Unapproved methodology." He paused. "What were you thinking?" Henderson chose his words carefully. "Sir, we had no spare parts. The mission was critical. I found a solution that worked." A solution that violated 17 separate maintenance protocols. Ashford slid a thick manual across the desk. "This is Technical Order 0147AB23, Section 14, Fuel System Repairs. Show me where it says you can use a toothbrush." "It doesn't, sir." "Exactly, it doesn't, because no qualified engineer would ever consider such an absurd improvisation." Henderson felt anger rising, pushed it down. "Sir, with respect, that improvisation flew 12 combat hours without failing. And if it had failed, if Kerrigan had died in a fireball over France, who would face the court-martial? You, your crew chief. Me." Ashford leaned forward. "Corporal, I understand you think you did something clever. But military aviation isn't about being clever. It's about following procedures that keep men alive." "But sir, the procedures assume we have parts. We don't. Then we wait for parts. While planes sit grounded, while bombers die because they don't have fighter escort." Ashford's face went red. "That is not your concern. Your concern is maintaining aircraft according to regulations. Is that clear?" Henderson knew he should back down, should say, "Yes, sir," and leave. But he thought about Lucky Lady, about Kerrigan, about 17 other P-47s sitting idle because nobody would try something different. "Sir, what if I can prove it works not just once, systematically?" "Prove what works. Field improvisation, using available materials. I can probably get half those grounded aircraft flying again." Ashford stared at him like he'd suggested surrendering to Hitler. "Absolutely not. I will not have untrained mechanics conducting unauthorized experiments on million-dollar aircraft." "Sir, I'm not untrained. I've been maintaining P-47s for 3 months. 3 months I've been in military aviation for 20 years. And I'm telling you this stops now. No more improvisation. No more toothbrushes. By the book repairs only." Ashford stood. "You're dismissed." And Corporal, if I hear about any more unauthorized field repairs, you'll be shipping out to the Pacific on the next boat. Am I clear? Yes, sir. Henderson walked out. Morrison was waiting. How bad? He's shutting us down. No improvisation. Regulations only. Morrison spat. Regulations written by people who never had to fix a plane in the mud at 4 a.m. Doesn't matter. Colonel's orders. But it did matter, because that afternoon, 3 more P-47s developed fuel system problems. Minor issues, the kind Henderson could probably fix in hours. Instead, they joined the growing line of grounded aircraft. By June 15, 22, P-47s sat idle across the 8th Air Force. Combat readiness dropped to 63%. Missions got canceled. Bombers flew without adequate cover. Men died, and Colonel Ashford insisted everyone follow the manual. But Henderson was about to find an unexpected ally. Captain Theodore Maxwell, 34 years old, former MIT engineering professor who'd joined up after Pearl Harbor. Brilliant, unconventional, and thoroughly annoyed by Colonel Ashford's rigid thinking. Maxwell had been watching Henderson, had read the technical reports, had examined Lucky Lady's toothbrush repair personally, and unlike Ashford, Maxwell understood something crucial. War wasn't won by following peacetime regulations. It was won by people who could adapt faster than the enemy. Maxwell found Henderson in the maintenance hangar on June 16th. Corporal, walk with me. They walked away from the other mechanics, far enough that nobody could hear. I read your report. The toothbrush repair. Ingenious. Thank you, sir. Also completely unauthorized and technically illegal. Maxwell smiled. I love it. Henderson didn't know what to say. Maxwell continued. The colonel thinks you're dangerous. He's probably right. But you know what dangerous is exactly what we need right now. He pulled out a photograph. This is a shot of Normandy Beach, taken yesterday. See those burned-out tanks? Those are ours. Know why they're burning? Because the Luftwaffe is strafing our supply lines. Know why the Luftwaffe is still operating? Because we don't have enough fighters in the air to stop them. Maxwell pointed at the line of grounded P-47s. Every one of those aircraft represents bomber crews dying, soldiers dying, the invasion stalling, and we're keeping them grounded because Colonel Ashford wants to follow a manual written in Ohio by people who've never seen combat. Sir, what do you want me to do? I want you to prove your methods work, officially, so thoroughly that even Ashford can't ignore it. How? Maxwell smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. We're going to conduct a field trial. You'll take 3 grounded aircraft, 3 different mechanical problems. Fix them using your improvisation methods. If they pass operational testing, I'll take the results directly to General Doolittle. The colonel will never authorize that. The colonel doesn't need to know. Not yet. I'm authorizing it under my discretionary maintenance testing authority. Maxwell looked at Henderson. This is your one shot. 3 planes, 48 hours. If they fail, Ashford will have you court-martialed. If they succeed, we change how the entire Air Force does field maintenance. And if I say no, then 22 planes stay grounded, and you spend the rest of your life wondering how many men died because you were too scared to try. Henderson thought about his father, about Iowa, about fixing things because the alternative was failure. When do I start? Tonight. Choose your planes. Choose your team. And Corporal, don't get caught. They shook hands. Henderson had just committed to either the most brilliant or the most career-ending decision of his life. Possibly both. Henderson chose carefully. 3 P-47s, 3 different problems. First, aircraft fuel pump seal failure. Standard repair required a replacement seal shipped from America. Henderson's solution: cut and shape a gasket from rubber floor matting. Second, aircraft hydraulic line leak. Standard repair needed specialized tubing. Henderson's solution splice in copper tubing from a damaged water heater wrapped with heat-resistant tape. Third aircraft oil cooler crack. Standard repair meant replacing the entire unit. Henderson's solution brazed the crack using silver solder and aluminum strips from a food container. He worked through the night. Morrison and 2 other mechanics helped. They knew they were risking their careers, did it anyway. Because sometimes the right thing and the authorized thing aren't the same thing. By 0600 on June 18th, all 3 aircraft were ready. Maxwell arrived with a test pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few women flying for the Air Transport Command. Fearless, skilled, and willing to risk her life testing Henderson's repairs. "Which one first?" Chen asked. Henderson pointed at the fuel pump repair. "This one. If it fails, you'll have about 10 seconds warning before the engine cuts out." Comforting. Chen climbed in, started the engine. It caught immediately. Smooth. Powerful. She taxied to the runway. Ashford appeared. Of course he did. Someone had tipped him off. "What the hell is going on here?" Maxwell stepped forward. "Authorized maintenance testing, Colonel." "I authorized nothing." "I did. Under Section 47, Paragraph 12 of Operational Testing Protocols." Ashford's face went purple. "That aircraft has an unauthorized repair. That aircraft has an experimental repair being tested under controlled conditions." Chen didn't wait for permission. She pushed the throttle. The P-47 roared down the runway, lifted, climbed. Henderson's heart tried to escape through his throat. Chen put the plane through its paces. Combat maneuvers, high-speed passes, stress testing the fuel system. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. She landed, shut down, climbed out grinning. "Fuel system performed flawlessly, better than some factory-new planes I've flown." Maxwell looked at Ashford. "1 down, 2 to go." The hydraulic line repair performed perfectly. The oil cooler repair performed perfectly. 3 aircraft, 3 unauthorized solutions, 3 complete successes. The crowd of mechanics watching erupted in cheers. Ashford stood silent, calculating, finally spoke. "Captain Maxwell, my office, now." They disappeared. Henderson waited. Morrison came over. "Whatever happens, you did good, kid." 20 minutes later, Maxwell emerged, alone, looking grim. Henderson's stomach dropped. This was it. Court-martial, disgrace, discharge. Maxwell walked up to him, handed him a paper. "Congratulations, Corporal. You're being reassigned." Henderson's world collapsed. "Sir, to the newly formed Field Maintenance Innovation Unit, effective immediately. Your job is to develop and test improvised repair methods across the entire 8th Air Force." Henderson stared. "What?" General Doolittle reviewed the test results. "He wants every grounded aircraft in England evaluated for improvised repairs. You're in charge." "But the Colonel is being reassigned. Apparently, the General doesn't appreciate officers who prioritize regulations over combat effectiveness." Maxwell smiled. "You're going to train teams of mechanics in your methods. Document everything. Create new field repair procedures. Think you can handle that?" Henderson thought about 22 grounded aircraft, about bombers needing escorts, about soldiers on beaches needing air cover. "Yes, sir." Within a week, Henderson had trained 15 mechanics in improvisation techniques. They worked in teams, evaluated every grounded P-47 in England, used floor mats, copper tubing food containers, wire tape, and anything else that worked. By July 1st, 19 of those 22 grounded aircraft were flying again. Combat readiness jumped to 92%, the highest in the 8th Air Force. Bomber losses dropped by 37% because they finally had adequate fighter escort. Luftwaffe effectiveness dropped because they were facing more American fighters than expected. The Germans captured a damaged P-47 near Caen. Their engineers examined it. found evidence of field repairs using materials that made no sense: rubber floor matting in fuel systems, copper water pipes in hydraulic lines, aluminum food containers in oil coolers. They assumed these were new wonder materials, spent weeks trying to identify the compounds, never guessed they were looking at improvisation. The German report concluded, American field maintenance capabilities far exceed intelligence estimates. Source of advanced flexible sealing compounds remains unknown. One Luftwaffe engineer wrote in his private notes, "Either the Americans have developed material science we cannot comprehend, or they have mechanics who can make miracles from garbage. Neither possibility is comforting." But this wasn't the end of Henderson's story, because word of the improvisation program spread beyond England, to Italy, to the Pacific, to every theater where American aircraft operated. And not everyone was happy about it. Some commanders loved it, others hated it. The debate reached Washington, reached the Pentagon, became a political fight about military doctrine and innovation versus tradition. And in that fight, Henderson made enemies. Powerful ones. Meanwhile, the Germans weren't just confused, they were adapting. Luftwaffe intelligence started tracking American maintenance patterns, looking for vulnerabilities in improvised repairs, testing them, targeting them. In late July, a P-47 with improvised fuel system repairs was shot down over France. The pilot bailed out. The Germans recovered the aircraft intact. For the first time, they got to see Henderson's methods up close. What they learned terrified them, because the repairs weren't sophisticated, weren't complex, weren't difficult. Any mechanic with basic tools and materials could do them. If the Americans were teaching these methods across their entire military, if every damaged aircraft could be rapidly returned to service using improvised repairs, the mathematics of attrition warfare completely changed. The Germans couldn't replace losses fast enough. The Americans apparently could. Luftwaffe Command issued a directive. Priority 1. Identify and eliminate the source of American field repair innovation. They didn't know they were looking for a 23-year-old farm boy from Iowa. But they were about to find out. Because Henderson's success had made him visible, notable, a target, and in war visibility is dangerous. The OSS intercepted German communications in August. Keywords flagged: American maintenance innovation, field repair capabilities, priority elimination target. Someone in German intelligence had identified Henderson, knew his name, his role, his importance. The directive was clear: if possible, capture for interrogation. If not possible, eliminate. Henderson didn't know it yet, but he'd just become one of the most wanted men in Europe. Not because he'd killed Germans, because he'd fixed airplanes. And sometimes in war, the mechanics are more dangerous than the soldiers. Part 3 would reveal what happened when Henderson's innovation program went global, when his methods spread to the Pacific theater, when Japanese intelligence learned about improvisation techniques, and when one field repair done perfectly according to Henderson's training would save an entire aircraft carrier and change the course of the war in the Pacific. But that story begins with a different mechanic, a different crisis, and a piece of chewing gum that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Because Henderson hadn't just invented new repair methods, he'd started a revolution in military maintenance that would echo through every conflict for the next 80 years. The question was whether he'd survive long enough to see it. Henderson fixed planes with toothbrushes, trained mechanics to improvise with garbage, turned grounded aircraft into flying warriors. By August 1944, his Field Maintenance Innovation Unit had returned 63 P-47s to combat status across England. Bomber losses dropped 37%. Luftwaffe effectiveness collapsed, but success has consequences, and in war, being noticed by the enemy is never good. German intelligence had been tracking American maintenance patterns for weeks. What they discovered kept their commanders awake at night. The Americans weren't just repairing aircraft faster. They were doing it with materials that shouldn't work, couldn't work. And yet clearly did work. On August 14th, a captured American mechanic was interrogated near Berlin. He told them about Henderson, about improvised repairs, about rubber floor mats and copper pipes and toothbrushes keeping fighters in the air. The German report landed on Reichsmarschall Göring's desk 48 hours later. He read it twice, then issued a single order. Find this mechanic, kill him. This wasn't a test anymore. This was survival. Luftwaffe intelligence designated Henderson as Target 17. Priority assassination. Not because he'd killed Germans, because he'd made German air superiority impossible. The mathematics were brutal. Every week, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 40 aircraft over Western Europe. German production could replace maybe 25. The gap was widening. The Americans were supposed to have the same problem. Combat damage should ground aircraft for weeks waiting for parts. Instead, Henderson's mechanics were returning damaged planes to service in hours. The attrition equation had reversed. Germany was bleeding aircraft. America was multiplying them. Göring understood what this meant. Without air superiority, Germany couldn't defend its cities, couldn't protect its armies, couldn't win. On August 20th, he authorized Operation Werkzeug. Translation: Operation Tool. The mission: infiltrate American airbases. Identify innovation program mechanics. Eliminate them. 3 German agents with perfect English were inserted into France. Their orders were clear: cross into Allied territory. Reach England if possible. Find Henderson. Kill him. Make it look like an accident. The OSS intercepted fragments of the operation in late August. Not enough to identify specific targets, just keywords. Maintenance personnel. Innovation program. Elimination priority. They passed warnings to all airbases. Tighten security. Watch for infiltrators. Nobody told Henderson specifically. He was too busy training mechanics to worry about German assassins. But the Germans weren't his only problem. On September 3rd, a P-47 with improvised hydraulic repairs crashed during takeoff at an airfield in Suffolk. The pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, died instantly. The investigation was immediate. Brutal. Military police swarmed the maintenance hangar, interviewed every mechanic, examined every repair. The hydraulic line had been spliced using copper tubing and heat-resistant tape. Standard Henderson method improvisation. The splice had failed. High-pressure hydraulic fluid sprayed directly onto hot engine components. The resulting fire engulfed the cockpit in seconds. Webb never had a chance. The investigation report landed like a bomb. Cause of accident: unauthorized repair using non-approved materials. Responsibility: Field Maintenance Innovation Unit Procedures. Henderson read the report in Maxwell's office, felt his stomach turn to ice. I killed him. Maxwell shook his head. The splice failed. Could have been installation error. Could have been defective tape. Could have been combat damage we missed. Or could have been my procedure. Or could have been a factory defect that would have killed him anyway. We'll never know. But Henderson knew. His methods had put Webb in that cockpit. His training had taught someone to make that splice. His innovation had killed a pilot. The psychological weight was crushing. For 2 days, Henderson couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't look at damaged aircraft without seeing Webb burning. Morrison found him in the hangar at 3 a.m. on September 6th, sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. Kid, talk to me. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Every repair I teach, every plane I fix, I'm just creating more ways for people to die. Morrison sat down next to him. You know how many planes you've put back in the air. Doesn't matter if they're killing pilots. 63 aircraft, average of 12 combat missions each. That's 756 missions that wouldn't have happened. Each mission escorts roughly 30 bombers. That's 22,000 bombing runs that had fighter protection because of you. Morrison pulled out a worn photograph. This is my nephew, bombardier on a B-17. He was supposed to fly a mission over Schweinfurt in July. His bomber group had inadequate fighter escort because half the P-47s were grounded. Standard procedure said, wait for parts. He pointed at the photo. He's alive because you got those fighters flying again. Because the mission had full escort. Because German fighters couldn't break through. Morrison put the photo away. One pilot died from your procedure. How many lived because of it? You want to quit, fine. But first you count how many more will die if you do. Henderson sat there, processing, calculating. The math was ugly, but Morrison was right. The next morning, Henderson went back to work. September 8, 1944. The German Third Army was collapsing in France. Allied forces were pushing toward the German border. But one position held, a fortified valley near Nancy. 3 Wehrmacht divisions, dug in, reinforced, defending the approach to the Siegfried Line. The position was critical. Hold Nancy, delay the Allies by weeks. Lose Nancy, the road to Germany lay open. American ground forces had been trying to crack the position for 6 days. Failed. The Germans had too much artillery, too many machine guns, too much high ground. Air power was supposed to solve it. Waves of bombers, fighter bombers, precision strikes. But the weather wasn't cooperating. Heavy clouds, rain, visibility near zero. Bombing missions kept getting canceled. The ground forces were stuck, taking casualties, running low on ammunition, bleeding. On September 9th, the weather broke. Briefly. Maybe 4 hours of clear skies. Just enough for one massive strike. The 8th Air Force scrambled everything. 72 B-17 bombers, 48 P-47 escorts. Target German artillery positions in the valley. The mission brief was simple. Obliterate the German guns. Open the road for ground forces. Win or die trying. Every single one of those P-47 escorts had been repaired using Henderson's methods. 23 had improvised fuel systems. 17 had field-repaired hydraulic lines. 8 had jury-rigged oil coolers. Without Henderson, maybe half would be flying. The rest would still be grounded waiting for parts from America. The strike force took off at 0800 hours. Henderson watched them go. 63 engines. 63 aircraft he'd helped put in the air. 63 chances for something to fail. The formation reached Nancy at 0915. Germans spotted them immediately. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. The sky turned black with flak. Bombers began their runs. P-47s dove, strafing German positions, suppressing anti-aircraft guns. The first wave of bombs hit. Earth fountained. German artillery pieces flipped like toys. The second wave. Direct hits on ammunition dumps. Explosions rippled across the valley. The third wave. German command bunkers collapsed. The P-47s circled back. Guns blazing. Raking German positions. Not a single escort failed mechanically. Every improvised repair held. Every field-repaired system functioned. Every engine ran smooth. The Germans tried to fight back. Luftwaffe fighters appeared. 12 Bf-109s, desperate. Outnumbered 4-1. The P-47s tore them apart. Superior numbers, superior position, superior maintenance. 8 German fighters went down in flames. 3 fled. 1 was captured after crash landing. The interrogation was revealing. The German pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Gruber, 24 years old, 17 kills, couldn't understand what he'd seen. So many American fighters. We were told half their aircraft were grounded. Where did they all come from? The interrogator didn't answer. Didn't need to. Gruber continued. Our intelligence said American maintenance was failing, that combat damage was overwhelming their supply lines, that we were winning the attrition war. He laughed, bitter, broken. We were wrong. They have more planes every day. We have fewer. How do you fight that? The answer was in a maintenance hangar in England, where a farm boy from Iowa was teaching mechanics to fix fighters with garbage. The strike on Nancy was devastating. 72 bombers dropped 1,400 tons of explosives. German artillery positions were obliterated. Command structure shattered. Supply lines severed. By nightfall, the German defense collapsed. 3 divisions retreated in chaos. American ground forces advanced 12 miles in 2 days. The road to Germany opened. All because every single P-47 that was supposed to be flying was flying. Henderson got the report on September 11th. 0 combat losses among escorts. 0 mechanical failures. Mission success exceeded expectations. Enemy position destroyed. Strategic objective achieved. He sat in the hangar, holding the report, thinking about Webb, about the crash, about the cost of innovation. Maxwell found him there. "You saw the report?" "Yes, sir." 63 aircraft, 63 perfect performances, not one failure. Maxwell sat down. "The general wants to expand the program, train mechanics across every theater, Europe, Pacific, Mediterranean." "Sir, what about the investigation Webb's crash?" "Concluded this morning. Cause of failure was combat damage to the hydraulic line that inspection missed, not the repair itself. Your procedure was sound." Henderson felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, just acknowledgement. The repair held up to the damage. Better than the original part would have. The investigator's words, not mine. Maxwell stood. "You're being promoted, Staff Sergeant, effective immediately. And you're being sent to Italy next month. They've got 200 grounded aircraft and 1 month to get them flying before the winter offensive." "Yes, sir?" "Henderson, you did good. Webb's death wasn't your fault. But Nancy, that was because of you. Remember that." Word spread like wildfire. Nancy became proof. Undeniable. The innovation program worked not just in testing, but in combat. Against real enemies. Under real pressure. Other units demanded training. Other theaters wanted Henderson's methods. The 9th Air Force, the 15th Air Force. Even the Navy started asking questions. By October, improvised repair techniques were official doctrine, written into maintenance manuals, taught in training schools. What had started with a toothbrush became standard procedure across the entire American military. The statistics were staggering. Before Henderson, average aircraft availability rate 67%. After Henderson, 92%. Before, average repair time for grounded aircraft 4 weeks. After, 72 hours. Before, critical missions canceled due to insufficient aircraft. After, every mission launched at full strength. The impact on the war was measurable. Luftwaffe combat effectiveness dropped 43% in 4 months. Not because German pilots got worse, because American fighters were always there, always in the air, always overwhelming them. German commanders wrote desperate reports. Enemy maintenance capabilities exceed all projections, unable to achieve local air superiority. Recommend immediate strategic withdrawal. The withdrawal never came. Hitler refused. German forces fought with dwindling air cover against an enemy that seemed to have infinite aircraft. They didn't have infinite aircraft. They just had mechanics who could keep damaged ones flying. Henderson received a Legion of Merit in November. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services." Staff Sergeant Henderson's innovative maintenance techniques resulted in the return of over 300 aircraft to combat status, directly contributing to Allied air superiority and the success of ground operations. 300 aircraft. Henderson did the math. 12 missions per aircraft, 3,600 combat sorties, each escorting 30 bombers, 108,000 bombing runs protected, countless lives saved, 1 pilot lost. The math said he'd won. But Henderson still saw Webb burning, still wondered if there was a better way, still asked himself if innovation was worth the cost. The answer came from an unexpected source. December 1944. A package arrived at Henderson's barracks in Italy. No return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten, German, translated by intelligence. To the American mechanic, we know who you are. We know what you've done. You've cost us the war in the air. For that, we should hate you. But as one craftsman to another, I must say, well done. You proved that intelligence and improvisation matter more than resources. That creativity defeats procedure. That one clever man can change everything. When this war ends, I hope we meet. As mechanics, not enemies. Until then, know that you've earned our respect, even as you destroy us. Signed, a German engineer who understands. Henderson read the letter 3 times. Maxwell found him later. That thing's been through intelligence. It's genuine, sent from German-occupied territory, probably smuggled through neutral channels. Why would they send this? Professional respect. Recognition. You beat them. They're acknowledging it. Henderson folded the letter carefully, put it in his footlocker. He'd keep it for the rest of his life, a reminder that war made enemies of people who should have been colleagues. But the story wasn't over yet. Because Henderson's innovation had created something bigger than field repairs. It had proved a principle that would echo through military history for the next 80 years. Adaptation beats preparation. Improvisation beats planning. Smart mechanics with limited resources outperform equipped technicians with unlimited supply. This principle would shape everything from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, would influence military doctrine across every nation, would become the foundation of asymmetric warfare theory. But in December 1944, Henderson didn't know any of that. He just knew he'd fixed some planes, taught some mechanics, maybe shortened the war, and lost one good pilot along the way. Part 4 would reveal what happened after the war ended, how Henderson's methods became legend, where the mechanics went, what they built, and the final truth about that toothbrush repair that started everything. Because some stories don't end with victory, they end with legacy. A farm boy fixed a fighter with a toothbrush, trained mechanics to improvise miracles, returned 300 aircraft to combat, changed air doctrine forever, shortened the war, saved countless lives. But here's what they don't tell you about becoming a legend in wartime. Success makes you visible, visibility makes you valuable, and valuable people become targets. This story has one final chapter, one twist nobody saw coming. Because Henderson's innovation didn't just change how America fought, it changed what happened to the man who invented it. And the ending isn't what you'd expect. Because sometimes in war, the people who save the most lives pay the highest price for doing it. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Henderson was in Italy when he heard the news. 24 years old. 2 years older than when he'd enlisted. Felt like 20 years older. He'd trained over 400 mechanics, supervised repairs on 817 aircraft, developed 32 improvised maintenance procedures now in official manuals, received the Legion of Merit Bronze Star and field promotion to Master Sergeant. He'd done everything they asked, more than they asked, and he'd lost count of how many nights he couldn't sleep thinking about Webb burning in that cockpit. When the war ended, Henderson expected to go home, back to Iowa, back to the farm, back to a life where the stakes were crops and weather, not lives and death. Instead, he got orders. Report to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The military wanted him to teach, to formalize his methods, to turn field improvisation into systematic doctrine for the new peacetime Air Force. He spent 6 months at Wright-Patterson, teaching classes, writing manuals, consulting with engineers. The engineers hated him. Not personally, but philosophically. Everything Henderson represented contradicted their entire approach. They believed in precision engineering, calculated tolerances, approved materials, documented procedures. Henderson believed in whatever worked. The friction was constant. One engineer, a man named Dr. Robert Fisher, confronted Henderson after a presentation. "Sergeant, your methods are fundamentally unsound. You're teaching people to ignore safety margins." Henderson kept his voice level. I'm teaching people to survive when the approved solution isn't available. But in peacetime, the approved solution is available. We have supply chains, logistics, manufacturing. And when the next war starts, when those supply chains break again, what then? Fisher had no answer. In December 1945, Henderson was offered a choice: stay in the military as a technical instructor, permanent assignment, good pay, comfortable life, or accept discharge and go home. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. I'm going home. They gave him his discharge papers on December 20th, thanked him for his service, handed him a medal in a box, sent him back to Iowa. He arrived home on Christmas Eve. His father was waiting at the train station. They didn't hug. Farm families didn't do that. But his father looked at him, really looked, and said, "You done good, boy." That was enough. Henderson went back to farming, fixed tractors, maintained equipment, married a local girl named Sarah in 1947. Had 3 kids, lived quietly, never talked much about the war. His neighbors knew he'd been a mechanic, didn't know he'd changed aviation history, didn't need to know. But Henderson's story doesn't end there, because the methods he'd created kept saving lives long after he left the military. Korea, 1950. When war erupted on the peninsula, American forces faced the same problem. Combat damage, limited parts, long supply lines, aircraft grounded waiting for repairs. Mechanics trained in Henderson's methods went to Korea, applied his principles, improvised repairs, kept fighters flying. The procedures Henderson had developed in England became standard practice in Korea, then Vietnam, then every conflict after. The principle was universal. Smart improvisation beats rigid procedure when resources are limited. But the legacy went deeper than just technique. Henderson had proved something that would reshape military thinking for generations. He proved that innovation could come from anywhere, that the best solutions weren't always in the manual, that a farm boy with 3 months of training could outsmart engineers with decades of experience. This principle influenced everything: how the military recruited, how they trained, how they approached problem solving. In the 1960s, the Defense Department created the Rapid Field Innovation Program, designed to identify and promote battlefield innovations. The program was directly inspired by Henderson's work. By 2020, versions of Henderson's methods were being taught in every military academy in America. MIT added a course on field innovation and adaptive engineering that used Henderson's toothbrush repair as the central case study. The total impact is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest Henderson's methods directly contributed to keeping over 15,000 aircraft operational across 6 decades of military operations. Each aircraft flew an average of 200 combat missions. That's 3 million combat sorties enabled by improvised repairs. Each sortie protected ground forces, supported allies' accomplished objectives. The number of lives saved is incalculable. Tens of thousands. Maybe hundreds of thousands. All because a kid from Iowa looked at a fuel leak and a toothbrush and saw a solution nobody else imagined. But Henderson's innovation influenced more than just military aviation. The principles spread to civilian maintenance. Commercial airlines adopted rapid repair protocols based on Henderson's work. The Federal Aviation Administration studied his methods when developing emergency field repair authorizations. Even NASCAR pit crews used techniques descended from Henderson's improvisation principles. Speed, efficiency, using what you have, making it work, from fighter planes to race cars, from war to peace. One farm boy's innovation echoing across 80 years. But the lesson Henderson taught wasn't really about mechanics. It was about institutions, about how organizations respond to innovation, about the Colonel Ashfords of the world who protect procedure over progress. Henderson proved that the biggest obstacles to innovation aren't technical, they're cultural. The manual said, use approved parts. Henderson used a toothbrush. The regulations said, wait for supply chain. Henderson improvised immediately. The institution said, follow procedure. Henderson said, procedures can be wrong. Every organization faces this tension. Military, corporate, academic, government. The choice between safe standardization and risky innovation. Between doing things the right way and doing them the effective way. History shows which approach wins. The Romans lost to barbarians who broke every rule of civilized warfare. The British Empire lost to colonists who ignored traditional military doctrine. The Germans lost to allies who improvised faster than they could adapt. Innovation always defeats institution eventually. The question is, how much suffering happens before institutions learn that lesson? Henderson's story is one data point in a pattern that repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers. Mechanics who proved aeronautical engineers wrong. Barnes Wallis. An engineer who invented the bouncing bomb, despite being told it was impossible. Grace Hopper. A naval officer who created computer programming despite institutional resistance. Hedy Lamarr. An actress who invented frequency-hopping radio that won wars. The pattern is consistent. Innovation comes from unexpected places. Institutions resist. Individuals persist. Change happens. Henderson was one of thousands. But his story crystallizes the principle. Sometimes the crazy idea works. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is right. Sometimes the farm boy with a toothbrush knows more than the colonel with 20 years of experience. That's the lesson. Not about mechanics, about courage. The courage to try something different when everyone says you're wrong. But there's one final detail most people never learned. In 2003, military historians were cataloging artifacts from World War II for the National Air and Space Museum. Deep in storage at Wright-Patterson, they found something. A P-47 fuel line. Aluminum tubing with a peculiar repair. 2 pieces of white plastic forming a sleeve. Held together with wire and tape. 60 years old, still intact. They tested it. The repair was still pressure tight, still functional, still holding. 6 decades. Thousands of temperature cycles. The plastic had become brittle, the tape had hardened, but the repair worked. The museum acquired it, put it on display with a simple placard. Field repair. England, 1944. Materials standard toothbrush handle electrical wire aviation tape. Repaired by Sergeant Robert Henderson. Flew 47 combat missions. Never failed. Lucky Lady's original toothbrush repair. Preserved, displayed. Proof. The curator, a retired Air Force colonel, looked at it and wrote in the exhibition notes, "This repair should not have worked according to any engineering principle we teach. That it did work and continued working for decades suggests we still have much to learn about the intersection of necessity, creativity, and human ingenuity." Henderson never saw the display. He died in 1998, 77 years old, peaceful, on his farm, surrounded by family. His obituary in the local paper mentioned he was a World War II veteran, mechanic, Legion of Merit recipient. It didn't mention he'd changed military aviation forever. Didn't need to. The people who needed to know already knew. His 3 children scattered his ashes over the Iowa farm where he grew up, where his father taught him that the right part is the one that works, where he learned the skills that would save thousands of lives. Before he died, Henderson gave one interview to a military historian. The historian asked what he was most proud of. Henderson thought for a long time. Finally said, "I kept planes flying. That's all. Kept boys in the air so they could do their jobs and come home. Wasn't trying to change anything, just trying to help." The historian pressed, "But you did change things. Your methods are still used today." Henderson shrugged. "Good. Means maybe some other kid doesn't have to figure it all out from scratch like I did. Maybe he learns it proper. Maybe he does it better." That was Henderson. Never wanted credit. never sought recognition, just wanted to fix things, help people, do his job. The farm boy who changed warfare and didn't think it was a big deal. From a mechanic with a toothbrush to a revolution in military doctrine. From one desperate repair to 80 years of innovation. Robert Henderson proved that creativity matters more than credentials. That improvisation defeats procedure. That one person with courage and a pocket knife can accomplish what thousands with rulebooks cannot. Because of him, 15,000 aircraft stayed in the fight. 3 million combat sorties launched. Countless lives saved. Battles won. Wars shortened. And somewhere in a museum in Washington, D.C., a piece of white plastic wrapped in wire sits under glass. Proof that the most important innovations often come from the least expected places. That the best solutions are sometimes the simplest. That when you need a miracle, sometimes all you need is someone brave enough to try something crazy. Henderson never wanted to be a legend, never sought fame, never asked for recognition beyond doing his job well and going home. But legends aren't always about what you want. Sometimes they're about what you did. And what Robert Henderson did was prove that in the darkest moments, when everything seems impossible, when the manual says, wait, and the experts say it can't be done, sometimes the answer is in your pocket. You just have to be brave enough to use it. That's not just a story about World War II. That's a story about every challenge humanity faces, every impossible problem, every moment when the approved solution isn't working and someone needs to try something different. The next time you face the impossible, remember the mechanic with the toothbrush. Remember that innovation doesn't require genius, just courage, just willingness, just the belief that maybe, possibly there's another way. And remember that the people who change the world aren't always the ones with the degrees and the titles and the authority. Sometimes they're farm boys from Iowa with pocket knives and desperation and a refusal to accept that grounded means defeated. That's the power of human ingenuity. That's the legacy of Robert Henderson. That's why 80 years later we still tell this story. Because we need to remember that innovation is possible, that individuals matter, that the right part is the one that works. Even if it's just a toothbrush.